Adam Markley, welcome to the show. Nice to meet you.
Yeah, nice to meet you, Nick.
So you're the CEO and founder of PROX Capital Group. Tell me about that.
Yeah, PROX Capital Group is a holding company I built over the last, better part of a decade at this point. Use that to acquire businesses both in the US and the UK. At this point, our portfolio is only US based. We were taking majority positions in those companies and ultimately through SBA loans and on and off market deals and things like that, we built a portfolio. Along the way, we've also started a couple of companies that also exist in our active portfolio. And then adjacent to that, over the last year, we've raised a fund to allow us to help invest in similar deals to support other operators who are looking to acquire but have an equity gap to fill. And that's our fund, PROX Search Capital.
So what's your background? How did you get into this?
Oh, quite the broken road, I'd say. I always knew I wanted to be in business acquisitions or do roll-ups or things like that without knowing what that meant back when I was 18 or 19, which is an unusual 18 or 19-year-old string of thinking. I went to Virginia Commonwealth University for undergrad. My family was a big UVA, Virginia Tech family, and I was a rebel without a cause. I went there and basically failed out of school after 18 months. And I went for engineering. I was bored, took more calculus than anyone ever should, and ultimately flipped to an accounting and finance business degree, and everything flipped for me. I ended up doing my entire undergrad degree in the next 2 years. So I actually graduated early. I was taking summer classes, a winter class, just kind of max loading while working full time as well. Just wanted to be done and get into the world. I don't consider myself a classic academic in any way. The irony is I subsequently got another degree and helped teach this at a university now. But yeah, so from there, just always felt connected to business. My first job out of college, I worked at a small regional public accounting firm working on small business clients. And that only solidified, right, the kind of thinking, well, how are these people making money that are clients, and how do I aspire to do what they're doing? From there, it led to a perfectly mediocre and what I would consider, as I lived it, unremarkable meandering corporate career. I left the public accounting firm, went and worked in the automotive space. I was the controller for a used car auto group, had sales, service, body shop, the whole thing. Left that, went into something in the hospitality space, a large franchisor or franchisee of Ruth's Chris, one of the larger ones at the time, plus had other restaurants and concepts. Went from there back to public, realized public was definitely confirmed not the right spot. In my second stint, I didn't get to work on small business clients, which is what I really enjoyed and why I wanted to go back. From there, after getting fired, as everyone's got a good termination story in there, I continued through, and after a couple more jobs, ended up in a very intrapreneurial, privately held business where the mantra was, if you see a void, fill it, and they're not going to stop you. And that was certainly life-changing in many ways. I was hired to be an accounting manager, and within 2 months, 3 months, had done basically nothing I was hired to do. I ultimately became without the title, but the operating kind of international CFO in many ways. I started basically commuting to Ireland as we built out businesses there and infrastructure there, and ultimately managing all the non-revenue generating business divisions in this company, probably 40, 50 million or so worth of businesses. And that satisfied that entrepreneurial itch pretty hard, overseeing, I want to say it was probably 400 or 500 people operating in these businesses, and did that for a few years. The company made some changes from the ownership side where they wanted a non-American to be operating on the international side. And so then I flipped into the revenue side of the business, and again, continued the trend of not doing what I was hired to do as I flipped, and ultimately started a whole division. And that division, I didn't have the prototypical background for the company. I wasn't natively a marketer or natively a copywriter or an idea generator in the classic sense for this business. And so I started negotiating deals as part of the creation of my division, joint ventures, some acquisitions, and things like that, and ultimately acquired in a very meta acquisition. I acquired an education company teaching people how to acquire companies. And ultimately, that fast tracked to me getting to where PROX Capital Group became a thing because as I acquired that, a year after it was acquired into the corporate I worked at, I negotiated to acquire it out with the original founder. And concurrent to all of this, started acquiring companies outside of my day job. And that's been where I've been for the last 6, 7 years, successfully, reasonably unemployed, as I like to say.
So you answered the question I was going to ask about your background. It's obviously very heavy in finance and accounting, and my question was going to be, where did you learn the art of the deal in acquiring companies? And you just described that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the familiarity with numbers is hugely valuable, and I think in many ways it's given me a leg up because I've seen and touched so many businesses at that point in my career. Not even counting where I am today, where I'm thousands and thousands of companies deep. But I think beyond that, it's even in that entrepreneurial company where I started my own division, and it was very much forcing you to you're building teams, you're running groups, you're operationally intensive. And because it was part of this very big marketing based company, you couldn't help but acquire those skills along the way, or you couldn't survive. You couldn't speak the language of those around. So when I think about the skills I have now, there's a rounding around operations, there's a rounding around marketing, and certainly the accounting and finance side. But I didn't do the classic investment banking or private equity or anything like that. A lot of this was homegrown, kind of ground up. A lot of people I work with in the space who have heard the story and understand how I work. I'm not the brightest guy. I'm just going to be the one who's not going to stop moving forward. It's a force of momentum. I'm going to kick the door jam, break my toe, and keep on going. And I think that's forced the education, if not from a thriving perspective, from a survival perspective, right? You make a decision, it doesn't go well, and you're not going to stop until you've overcome whatever that, in some way, self-made obstacle. Not that there aren't enough obstacles in the world anyways, but it allows for just that continuity of push. But yes, the accounting and finance background, I always felt and didn't necessarily realize in full, it gave the strength of skill sets I needed, especially in understanding things at a small business level where things are going to be messy and you've got to blend ops and finance so much.
I want to go back to one of the things you said about that large company you're working for and their statement of if you see a void, fill it. A lot of companies probably say something similar to that. It's really hard to make that successful. So I'm curious, what were they doing that made that successful?
Yeah, I think one, they prioritized hiring talent, just finding a way to enable that talent to do what that talent was capable of. And there are guardrails and frameworks around it, but yeah, they just embrace the idea that you can come in and if you see something and can execute on supporting it, then go for it. Some people would have incredible trajectories in the business as a result if they came in and had particularly talent and the ability to create impact. And for a lot of people tied on the revenue generation side, where the tip of the spear, the people who were running the marketing or the copywriting, the authoring of ideas in a way that would convert customers. Some of those individuals would be making multi-seven figures because the outputs from their results. And so there's this idea that culturally, if you're going to execute well, you're going to be able to drive substantial individual value. And while I was not a copywriter, I was still able to, I was even abdicating. Like, I'm not the right guy for running this division. I just have the idea for how to do it. And they're like, don't care. If it's going to happen, you'll do it. And that's petrifying in every way, in every sense of that word. But you realize if you want to go do something, no one else is going to do it for you. And they're opening the door. You just got to walk through it and see what happens. And I think the benefit of a strong intrapreneurial culture, and this is hard in small business, much easier in larger businesses, but the strength in a culture that is reliant on that is it rewards and creates a stickiness of opportunity for people who might not have the risk tolerance, able to go do it in their own because risk looks different. They've got some kind of a shell or wrapper around them. But those people can be incredible ideators, can be incredible executors, and can make a huge difference on their ability to go out and create value, opportunity, etc. And I think more companies should strive to do it in practice within the framework of understanding I could go fill those voids. The expectation was I'm then leaving one behind me as my focus shifts. And part of the thing that worked really well was if I'm going to go fill the void, the expectation to some degree was I got to make sure I know what the plan is for the void I'm leaving behind. So as I elevated and changed, it was backfilling responsibility to some degree. My number two in my Holdco and in PROX, he was someone I hired while I was at this company to fill the void behind me as I started this division. The job I was hired to do that was no longer going to be my priority. I hired him to fill that. And here we are many years later. He ultimately stayed at the company longer than I did and then, moved over to work with me subsequently. And yeah, it's that kind of mindset of you can go wherever you want or have the capability of creating value within the confines of what this business does. But you'll have a responsibility as you do it to make sure you're solving the problems you're creating along the way. And I think that's where a lot of companies don't necessarily find success in it, is they then feel like they're having to plug holes consistently if people are off with their ideas.
Yeah, that's a really insightful way to think about it. And I also like the description of having these people that really excel just in the safety of a company, right? Where, they don't want to take on the risk of going out on their own. I've never really thought about it like that. That's an interesting way to put it.
Yeah, entrepreneurship is strange in that way. You have the accidental entrepreneur who never intended to be one. It just happened, and typically it happened in a way in which some of that risk it never goes away, but it's mitigated in some capacity. It's why it's accidental. They started something, started making some money on the side, and it turned into replacing the day job and then some, and it's feels like a lower entry point in that way. But the person who's just cold stopping everything and just throwing themselves off the cliff into to what that journey is, yeah, that's hard. And if you've got a partner, a spouse, you've got a family or anything like that, those are barriers to enter into the entrepreneurial path. And to do so in an environment where you're not necessarily worried about the short-term cash implications, meaning you're still collecting whatever comp or salary you're making. You're not even necessarily worried about, bank accounts and like business structures and all that. You're just able to go, I'm going to do a thing. I'm going to try a thing and it can work out. Yeah. I think it just creates that unshackling that is the aversion to taking levels of risk, because risk is a spectrum. We're all on there somewhere. And I joke about this a lot. I run a pretty large acquisition group here in Denver where I live. And, you look at this room, we meet monthly and there's, 100 plus people every month showing up. It's the largest group of its kind in the country. And, we're all the right or wrong kind of broken, depending how you look at it. We're all, and broken's got a negative connotation, but we've all got a different level of mental chemistry or what have you, to where In our case, these people are going to go buy a company that's worth maybe $5 million, and they're going to go sign a personal guarantee on a loan for everything they own is at risk if this goes sideways, to where they're going to take that leap. If they're partnered or have a family, I mean, the hardest sales conversation they'll ever have in their life is convincing their spouse, let's risk everything and make this what we do. In the comparison of acquiring an existing business and taking that leap where literally everything you own is at risk versus the kind of pseudo classical entrepreneur who's starting up a business, maybe raising capitals, a seed round or a series, and they're trying some level of scale. If that fails, the worst thing they've lost is typically time. In this case, you lose not just time, but your outcome on the failure side is bankruptcy. And so it takes a level of brokenness. And I think that entrepreneurial environment for a lot of companies can enable people who aren't willing or capable of taking that risk to have a softer landing and or more latitude to go do something exceptional.
So explain that extreme risk a little bit more, because I mean, you and I understand what a PG is and how it
Yeah.
works because we're in the space. But for the folks that don't understand, because I've heard people talk about it, but not in the way that you just framed it, that you could potentially lose everything, which is very different than the VC startup route.
Yeah. Yeah. So a personal guarantee is the easiest equivalent is to talk about your primary residence, right? When you go buy a home for you and your family to live in, you're getting a mortgage. That 30-year mortgage also carries a personal guarantee. And that guarantee says, if you don't pay this loan, we can take all your assets, right? This works the same way just with a business acquisition. The federal government has something called the Small Business Administration, and it facilitates loans to people looking to acquire businesses. Traditional commercial loans will work the same, especially in the smaller scale. And what those documents say is no different than your mortgage, that, hey, by the way, everything you own is at risk. You are personally and individually, and if you're married, likely jointly guaranteeing the value of the loan. And unlike a property, for example, you go buy a primary residence, although in today's world, we used to say it was maybe a few $100,000. Now it's more depending on where you live. It could be $1 million, could be $500,000, anything in between. With these business acquisitions, when you're taking a real leap, and there's qualifiers to this, but if you're taking the leap, you could be signing a $5 million guarantee. And it's unlikely you're ever buying an individual residence at the stage of life you're in to where you're going to sign that scale of a personal guarantee. It will typically be the largest individual transaction most people will make, certainly to that point in their life, even if they've bought property. And so because of that, it's unlikely most people have a liquid or attachable net worth that's $5 million. And so in the case of a default, you will lose everything. You will go bankrupt. You'll go through that process. Any assets you have will be liquidated and paid into the bank. And so because of that, there is a steep cliff of risk, and you've got to have almost an irrational level of belief in yourself and your capabilities and your skills to even make the leap. As someone who's been in that game, I've signed those personal guarantees on 4 of my own acquisitions. As we invest in deals, one of my barometers of whether I'm going to invest or not is simply, if I wouldn't sign that personal guarantee, how can I ask someone else to for the benefit of me deploying capital and investing? Because if I can't ask them to do it, and I won't, then I shouldn't be able to I shouldn't be able to put them in that position. And so I think it's an important thing is you understand kind of the entrepreneurial scales of risk, right? Comparing a venture is very easy, right? Or even stepping back into that a very entrepreneurial company, how that weighs out against a startup, which carries far more opportunity cost than, say, doing something inside of a company like I mentioned in my past, all the way to the far end, which is it's far more binary of, if it works, great. If it doesn't, you're rebuilding from scratch. And there are sadly plenty of stories of people who have had to rebuild, but I think it highlights why certain levels of entrepreneurship are connective and make sense to people because everyone slots in different from their risk tolerance and their capabilities. I could never do a classic venture startup. I'm not smart enough with ideas.
I don't want to get hung up on the negative, but and you mentioned it very quickly there, but do you know of stories where this has bankrupted folks?
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. It's a big reason why I spend my time the way I do. As someone who has signed these personal guarantees and I would argue not even thrived, again, survived through it, because these are incredibly hard. And once you've applied a huge amount of debt or leverage to a business, it changes how it works, and you've got to be able to navigate that. And sometimes timing matters, and you can't control timing. Sometimes you've missed things in due diligence, or sometimes you've misunderstood something about the process. And sometimes, transparently, they're not the executor or operator they believe themselves to be. And I think at any of these points, there's internal and external factors that can lead to a lack of success, but it's challenging. I know literally last week I was traveling, I was down in Miami for an event, talking to someone who'd bought a company. I'd seen him on stage at a conference talking about his acquisition. And I would say there's probably an 85 to 95 or up to 100. He's on the wrong end where it's that high of a likelihood that he will ultimately go bankrupt at this point. Smart guy. And so, yeah, these things happen. It's unfortunate. Overall, the historic default rates are fairly low for people getting these loans, but they're not zero by any stretch. And so it is something to be eyes wide open in. And it's why I run the communities I run. It's why I help teach this at the University of Colorado. It's trying to put out there enough good messaging that, one, this isn't the path for everybody. And two, if it is the path, here are ways you can increase your likelihood of success. And I think this applies as a lesson to all types of entrepreneurship and all types of, even in your own, say you're a W-2 employee and you're just working in a job, this applies for this as well. As what are you doing to increase your likelihood of success? All businesses at the end of the day is a giant probabilistic study. And just like going to Vegas and you're playing roulette, you're going red or black. At the end of the day, if you can count cards, you're going to get a blackjack because you're increasing your likelihood of success, or you're going with the deep enough pockets where you can play the double down strategy every time you lose on these 50-ish 50 type bets. And the idea is that anything you're doing should be about increasing your likelihood of success, because I'd rather own 50% of something that's going to be more likely to be successful than 100% of something that isn't. And I think we as entrepreneurs, people who are choosing this kind of path, we intentionally set ourselves up. We want to control, we want to own. It's part of what's motivating us to go down these paths. But when there's risk associated with it, we've also got to create that balance. And for me, the question isn't how big can I get this? How much money will I make? What's the lottery ticket kind of mindset around buy something, do something, make tons of money? It's what am I doing to increase my likelihood of success? Because the learning curve is going to be steep. And anything I can do to stack the deck in my favor will allow me to execute far more effectively. Because for most entrepreneurs, your first startup, your first acquisition, your first intrapreneurial venture, whichever kind of category you're in, will rarely be your last. Rarely. And because of that, if you just make sure the first one's as close to a success as possible because you stack the deck, it'll only set yourself up for further success down the road because you have now capital and experience to trade on in which you didn't have before.
So you have a holding company that owns multiple companies.
Correct.
Is there like here's the 5 things you tell all of your companies to do what you just said, to stack the deck in your favor, to push the odds towards you to be successful? These are the 5 things I want all of my companies to be doing.
I don't know if I think of it as 5 things because they're all different companies in slightly different stages of life. 2 of them are startups, 7 of them have been acquired, and then these don't count the companies we own via the fund, right? First and foremost, and it's funny because I've got the startups and acquired businesses, so I've seen both sides, and the startups, I would say, are less intentional, more closer to the accidental, and because I'm already established as an entrepreneur, the likelihood of their success is exponentially higher than someone starting their first business from scratch with no entrepreneurial experience. So huge disclaimers. For those businesses, it's setting targets and being aggressive. Right? Both of them operate in pseudo agency type models where we've got clients. One's a fractional accounting and back office business that we built for ourselves. And then it became an accidental company because people asked us for help. And that particular kind of any agency model, this is not my concept. So I'm borrowing it from someone else. I also own a couple marketing agencies. And so we use the same mindset there. But it's the role in any agency or any business services company is get clients is one and keep clients is the other. And for us, we've taken an incredibly intentional approach of making sure there is a clear ownership of the get and keep clients buckets, and that each of those businesses has someone who's focused on get and someone who's focused on keep. And because of that, that can create a lot of latitude for the person out there driving business development and things like that because they're not focused on the fulfillment. And then the remit or the expectation of the person focused on fulfillment is whether they sell 1 new client or 5 new clients or 10 new clients in a month, your job is to make sure the team can catch, onboard, and serve those clients with exceptional quality. Nothing less. Like that is the standard. If it's not good enough for me, since I'm a client of all of my own businesses, basically, then it can't be good enough for anyone else. And so for those particular businesses, again, it's less about the 5 things. It's about setting those expectations and those tones in a way that allow for the individuals to have the clear direction and clear path to go. Now, am I going to dictate you have to go function on each of those sides directly? No. I'm I've hired people with the expectation coming in, you're to own this, and this is your compensation reflects that, your structure reflects that, but here's the overall goal and target we're shooting for.
What's the title of that person that's responsible for that onboarding success? I'm curious if it's like an account manager or a project manager, like what is it?
Yeah, so head of operations, ultimately for us, they are running the ops, right? Ops is about fulfilling the clients in a services business, and this means they're overseeing the team, the staff, the training, the development, the transitional in our fractional back office biz, right? So our primary type of client is supporting people who are acquiring companies because we have a huge amount of reps at understanding those transitions and the complexities. Secondarily, we'll help people if they're looking to sell their business, help make sure their accounting and back office is organized and ready to go. And then just general small business would be kind of the broadest, biggest bucket. But the idea is that when we get a new client, the get client person is taking them, working with them into a transition, and that handover happens to ops. And that is where the interconnectivity. It isn't in a mic drop and you're like, best of luck, here's Jim. Try not to screw that up. It's especially if it's someone in a transaction, you're working through the transaction, and that's all still part of the get clients piece because it's transitioning through that kind of complex and then handing over to the ongoing. And so there is a zippering and that crossover that happens on the services. But, our head of ops, he's a former successful entrepreneur in his own right, right? It's been intentional that this business, while it's a fractional accounting business, is not run by your classic bean counters. Neither our head of ops or Ryan, who's the president of that business or lead of the business, neither of them have that background. They've learned the skills, but their main skills were on the actual business operations management side. Ryan, early in his career, worked in medical staffing. He helped take a business from 5 million to 20 million of revenue before helping the owner sell the business. before I hired him in my prior jobs. And Travis was our head of ops. He and his brother helped scale a security consulting business, and they just exited to private equity a year and a half ago. Right. So people who have seen it, lived it, done it, and understand the real impetus that comes behind business operations. Because in this case, the accounting is not the hard part. It's understanding how that connects dots. And that's how we think internally as well, is like the numbers aren't the hard part. It's, can we be the resource and ally? And so again, as we think about interfacing and how we break down that from a roles and responsibilities, it allows us to create that supportive structure where the get client side will know what the operation side's capabilities are, but the goal is to always have the operation side running as fast as the client development side is going, and to be able to catch it. And that's the core expectation, because you never want to turn off the faucet. It's hard to get those momentum, those flywheels continuing if you stop them.
I want to go back to the personal guarantee for just a second, and I'm going to
Yeah.
stack a whole bunch of questions together here. You are investing in self-funded searcher deals, so you're making bets on these individuals that fill that operator role. You mentioned earlier that in order to do this, all of us have some type of irrational belief in our own abilities. So there's, these people are kind of crazy to begin with anyway. So part of the question is, how are you screening for your comfort level in these crazy people to be successful? So that's half the question. The other part is on the deals that ultimately had a problem, like the businesses weren't successful. I'm curious what you've seen, because the ones that I know of, just off the top of my head, have involved some type of seller fraud, for lack of a better term. There's just something fundamentally misrepresented in the business that is just impossible to overcome, especially when some of these companies are very, very small, right? They can't survive a $500,000 hit of whatever it is. Two questions, like how are you screening folks that are searching for these companies, and what's kind of a commonality of deals that you see go south?
Yeah, great questions. So first of all, we always have to make sure it's a good business to begin with, and that'll tie to the second question. But the hope is it a good business? Right? When you're investing in this space, you're underwriting the business, the horse, and you're underwriting the jockey, the operator. On the horse side, a lot of this is kind of the basic understanding of how the business operates, operational infrastructure, things like that. On the individual side, I've come up with my twist on the 7 degrees of separation from Kevin Bacon that hopefully a lot of people have heard of. For me, it's a 1 degree of separation from a core competency, skill set, level of experience you have. And invariably, anytime I'd say that, people come back and they say, I've been a tech sales guy for the last 10 years. What do I know about anything? And you're like, let's actually think about it and break it down. You're comfortable getting told no. You've got some business development chops. You maybe have led a sales team, so there's some management. But also look outside your professional life, because experience can come from all aspects of life. I think my most extreme example of this, certainly not a space that was investable, but an extreme example of this level of non-professional experience. A woman I met, she worked for one of the largest private equity groups in the country. Okay. Very successful in that. While she was not on the investment side, she was heavily on the marketing strategy, et cetera. She comes to me and says, hey, I'm looking at antique stores. And you're like, forgive me for not understanding the direct correlation between mega multi-billion-dollar PE and small antique stores. Turns out for the last 15 years in her individual life, she traveled to 9 countries, scouting antiques, reviewing antiques, acquiring antiques, and had built a depth of understanding and knowledge in that space. So the challenge I always say to people is, it doesn't have to be the thing you were paid to do, but it absolutely should be something you've got some level of expertise in and some understanding. Underpinning all of this would still be something I've mentioned previously, which is you probably shouldn't do this. Most people shouldn't do this. You just shouldn't. There's a lot of online marketing these days around mailbox money, basically. Zero money down, buy a company, do the thing. I mean, I won't mention the names of the people running those, but I used to own an education company like this. I've been out of that space for a long time, but I know what that space looked like long before it's blown up to the scale it has today. And I think it's important for people to realize that it truly is not the right path for most people. And knowing that is arguably one of the most important things to think about when evaluating an operator is truly, are they the right person? Does their experience, knowledge, resilience, their ability to get punched in the face repeatedly and keep on going? There's a lot of people who have military experience that tend to do well here because they've just learned how to fight through the fire. There's a resilience that comes from the training they've had. And they've typically led people and managed people of all calibers and types. And but you can come from any kind of background and find a way to fit in this, but you have to have that radical honesty with yourself. And so all of that's really important on the operator side and understanding that. What was the second piece?
Yeah, it was just anecdotal. It seems like it's seller fraud, right? That's what I've seen.
Yeah, I would tend to agree on the most likely reasons. Seller fraud is a big one. There's no doubt. A huge number of them. But is it really the seller's responsibility or fault when, in a good number of the cases where it has gone sideways because of a seller issue, the operator or soon to be operator didn't invest in the appropriate level of due diligence? Whose fault is that? So in a lot of those cases, they skipped true financial due diligence, equality of earnings. They skipped a level of operational or legal due diligence. Doesn't mean it can't happen, right? I've had to take legal action against the seller of a business I've acquired. But, and I think it goes back to maximizing likelihood of success. Okay, so these things can happen. Stop max levering deals, right? Protect your liquidity because your liquidity as the guarantor matters if you've got to pay a loan out of your own pocket for a couple months. Like one of our acquisitions, I paid for that loan for 2 years out of my own pocket. No seller issue per se, macro conditions, some other things like that. And I'm cash got tight and I had to pay for it. I was fortunate to be in that circumstance. Most people aren't because they leverage themselves to the hill, or if they've got $500,000 liquid, they're going to put all of it into the deal as opposed to raise capital. Take me out of the picture. You can't use me, right? But go raise capital and make it smart capital, value added capital, because then you're lowering the leverage. You're getting a healthy balance sheet. You're creating an ecosystem of success, et cetera. You've got people who've been there, done that, supportive. And because of that, if something were to happen from a seller issue or otherwise, you've got a much more resilient business to begin with as the one that is already dancing on the knife's edge as to whether or not you can survive. And people go into this expecting they're just going to grow through anything. And growth is one of the most expensive things in business. It eats cash like you couldn't believe. If you're not even planning ahead to what it costs to grow, you're just working hard enough to get the transaction done and not planning for the hard phase, the next phase, which is running the company, you're going to set yourself up for failure. And so while the sellers can absolutely be blamed, and I think there's a fairly strong correlation between likelihood of outcome and not, so much so that I actually incorporate that into our underwriting. But because of that high likelihood from that side, you should be asking yourself, how do I set myself up for success? How am I structuring this in a way that's beneficial? Make some of the deal really contingent on seller performance using contingent notes or otherwise. It was SBA deals, you can't use an earnout. So contingent notes are allowable where you only pay if a certain criteria has been met. But otherwise, it's planning into this. Like when we invest, right? So we're kind of unique in that for a fund of our size in this space, we're the only one in the country that does a site visit on every company we invest in. The only one.
That seems pretty basic stuff.
Yeah, you would think, but it's private equity does this all the time, but the economics are just skinnier at the small side, and so there's not a company we've invested in or will invest in that we won't go see in person. It's just part of the required process. And the biggest thing I'm looking for there is we're 2 months into this process, you've gotten your legals done, you've got a commitment letter from the bank for your funding, you've got our equity fairly committed, plus another investor or 2, you've got a well-built capital table. I'm going to show up and we're gonna spend most of the day with you and the seller. And the reason is I'm watching how you, the buyer, soon to be operator, are interacting with the seller. Because if that relationship isn't going well, at that point, doing a transaction or completing the transaction is an amplifier of good and bad. It's not a change, it's an amplifier. So if that relationship's strained, it will only be amplified by the acquisition. If it's really good, it will be amplified by the transaction. And same with any of the other mechanics, the deal structure. AMP is an amplifier post acquisition because you have leverage. If you're 80% leverage, that means every impact has such a multiplied outcome, which is why it's an attractive space for people to get into. But it's why we do those site visits. It's inherently important. It's also why the fractional back office business we have, which we built for us when we were doing this and we were experiencing the challenges we faced, is that we don't invest without that business supporting, overseeing, managing, or in some cases, just fully running the back office of the operating companies. Because in the vein of actually going and doing the transaction and actually trying to make this successful, an operator has to spend their time on 4 things and 4 things only: the actual core operations of the business, the sales of the business, the people in the business, and the process or the workflows of the business. If it's anything but those 4 things, they're drastically increasing their likelihood of failure. And so by creating an environment where we're helping vet the seller, we're helping structure and navigate the deal and capitalize it for success, and then post-acquisition, we're wrapping around to help make sure they're spending their time on the things that matter, has such a huge impact to the likelihood of success, right? We have a client of our accounting business. It's not a deal we invested in. This was a second time searcher, a second time buyer, right? He bought 20 months later, sold his business, did well, and then bought another one. And it's so funny. He asked us to help run his back office. He spent the entire first month in the field of that business. And it wasn't until roughly 75 days after the transaction, he reached out to us and was like, "Do I have a QuickBooks login?" That, as ironic as that sounds, is actually a pretty good thing, right? We're delivering the financial reporting, we're delivering all of that stuff. So he's got the information already at hand. It's all daily transactions and everything's there. So it's real-time accounting. But he didn't actually have to log in the accounting system and actually do anything. And that means he spent so much more time on the things that matter. I think we are trying to sniff out for people who don't want to play business, but actually do business. When I say play business, it means you're going to sit behind a desk, you're going to sit behind a computer, you're going to click around buttons, and maybe you book some invoices and paid some invoices and logged some things. While technically you were productive, the reality is you played business. You weren't out leading, you weren't out driving, you weren't out meeting customers and meeting suppliers and integrating with your team. And because of that, you're forfeiting huge opportunity. You've got to be in the business, living with the people. It's how they build trust with you. It's how they understand you. It's how you then understand them, and that they're going to believe when you say we're going to do a new thing or try a new thing, because they've actually seen you dig a hole with them. They've actually seen you get on a roof with them. They've actually seen you do things that build that trust. And so yes, sellers are a huge number one reason, but there's so many things you can do to protect yourself against that extreme level of potentially fraudulent stuff and put yourself in a position where you can be successful in spite of. And I think that underlying level of support or proactive thinking is probably one of the number one things I see people not thinking through when they're going down this path. is they're already putting the furniture in the house of future success and not focusing on the grind and the hard and maximizing their outcomes.
Adam, I think that's really good advice and insight. I could probably talk to you for 3 hours just because, this is the world we live in. But I want to be conscious of your time and, appreciate you sharing all of these things. How could folks find you if perhaps they've got a deal, they're trying to fill the equity gap? How can folks find you?
Yeah, great question. Two things. LinkedIn's always great. Adam Markley. Secondarily, you can go to PROX Capital Group or proxsearchcapital.com. If you're looking for investment, PROX Search Capital is the better. So PROX searchcapital.com. Yeah, I mean, this is a space I love. My kind of standing offer, and people sometimes get mad when I say it, but because they feel it's not genuine. It really is. I strive hard to be the person I needed 10 years ago that didn't exist. And I've earned the scars and the hardships and survived through it. And I just don't want people to do bad deals. No deal is infinitely better than bad deals. And people get in that desperation to get something done, and then they make a decision that will either put them on the track to bankruptcy or put them on the track to what I call as debt purgatory, where you make enough to pay the loan and maybe pay yourself $100K a year or something like that, but you don't make enough money to actually reinvest in the business and drive growth. And that is a jail cell for sure. And so it's a matter of really being helpful. So my standing offer is always, if you have a deal and you want a second set of eyes on it, where people, someone who's looked at this point, thousands and thousands and thousands of companies, is reach out. We'll take a look. You spend a half hour going through it. I don't need anything for it. I'm not charging. That's not how it works. It's just, I just don't want you to do a bad deal. If ultimately you need investment, great. But I don't go into any of those conversations with the expectation that I'll do anything more than help you avoid as much as I can a problem.
I think that's great, Adam. This is a really special community, I believe, and I've seen content that you have out there other places, and I know that your offer there is genuine. So appreciate that, and appreciate you spending some time with me here.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Thanks for having me on, and look forward to continuing chatting.
Great. Thanks, Adam.